Good morning, Faith family, and those of you who are joining us at our RH Church at Home. Man, we are so glad that you decided to tune in, to watch, and to engage with us. Listen, I want you to hear my heart first before we even get into today's message. I know, these days are different. These are challenging times. But I know those of you who are watching this, most of you, you wish your desire would be to be with us as a family. Hey, I want you to know, we want you to do what you feel is best for you and your family. When we say this, we sincerely mean this. Your health is of great importance to us. We don't want you to feel peer pressured into being here, into joining us. You are deeply missed, but please understand this. You are still a great part of our faith family. Whether you're here in person or you're watching this at our RH home, you're part of the family. The church is not about the walls that make up this building. The church is about us, about people, about the faith family. So while you are missed, understand this, please. And I hope you know this and I hope you feel this. You are loved and you are still a great part of this family. All right, so this morning, I want us to look at something that I think is critical during this season. I mean, really, it's one of these things that, it should be important during all seasons of life. But I think in light of what we've had to spend the last 2.5 months going through, maybe it's shed some greater importance. Today, I want to talk about love. We're going to be in Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, and really it's going to be verses 28 through 34. This is a portion of scripture that I've touched on several times in different messages and highlighted. It's a passage of scripture that's probably pretty recognizable to most people. Jesus finds himself in a really interesting period in his life. Over the last few weeks, whether in our Sunday morning lessons, kind of leading up into Easter and coming out of Easter, on our Wednesday night Bible studies as we've kind of been going through the book of John, we've talked a lot about those last few days, in really week of Jesus' life. And this, we find this in the midst of it. And I think that's important for us to understand. So even if you just if you gaze in your scripture, sometimes you have it highlighted, different sections that are highlighted with different things going on. You look at Mark chapter 11, it begins with the triumphal entry. When Jesus goes into Jerusalem, kind of claiming it as a king. It's the understanding that he's soon to go to the cross. And now we had that little interaction there of the fig tree when Jesus cleanses the temple. And then you have what we're going to look at today, and then really right after that, you have these signs of Jesus kind of telling his disciples what's going to happen. You get into chapter 14. There's the plot to kill Jesus, the Last Supper, the Garden of Gethsemane, and so this really takes place right in the midst of it. And I think it's important because we're big sticklers on context. Looking at everything, the few verses before that verse and the few verses after, and understanding, when and why that verse is taking place. And so sometimes we look at this and we step back and we think, well, that sounds good and it's kind of easy. But in this context, what Jesus says is absolutely profound. But even I want us to think of this really through Jesus's lens and this season that he's in. And so we have this in Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 28, and again, just to kind of lead up, Jesus has been kind of harassed by some of these spiritual, what we'd call leaders of the day, the spiritual teachers of that time, and they've been pushing him and prodding about all these different questions, and really, it's a way in which they're trying to get Jesus trapped to say something maybe sacrilegious or to really turn the mobs against him. And in the midst of it, there's this one individual, this scribe, who's kind of taken to Jesus. He's really become really intrigued with Jesus. And the way I kind of picture this, you have this man who was probably there to pin Jesus, but in the midst of Jesus interacting with the scribes and Pharisees, he begins to perk this individual's mind. And so this scribe, I think, very genuine and authentically asked Jesus a question. And so verse 28 says, and one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, which commandment is the most important of all? And so again, I don't necessarily think he's trying to trap Jesus. I think the way in which Jesus was answering all these questions, it began to intrigue him. And so he asked Jesus, hey, of all the different commandments, and now understand, there were a lot of commandments. The Old Testament, which is what they were abiding by. You get into the laws of Moses. There's a lot of laws, and even really coming out of that, some more, man-made religious laws. And so this guy's like, hey, like Jesus, obviously you're wise, you're understanding, you're answering all these questions. So help me understand, what's the most important law to keep? That's a pretty good question. I kind of wonder sometimes if I had Jesus alone and just Jesus and I were having a conversation, like what would you ask him? I mean, I know there might be certain things, I don't know that you would ask him for, next week's lotto numbers, or maybe you're like been intrigued with like different things in the Bible, and you might ask him why those things happen. You might ask him maybe for him to clarify different things in your life. Like in this season right now, maybe you go and if you were with Jesus, you would say, man, Jesus, why is all this COVID-19 happening? So I don't know what you would ask, but man, this is a good question. Like of all the things that are important, like what's the most important commandment that we should keep? And it says in verse 29, Jesus answers. He says the most important is, and he ends up really sharing a verse from the Old Testament. And he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So before he even really gets into it, he reminds them that, listen, there's one God. There's one Lord. Don't get off track. Don't be persuaded by other things. Don't allow certain things to grab a hold of you to where they kind of become your God. He before he gets into the commandment, he says, listen, don't forget, there is one God. There's one Lord. Okay? And then he says this. He says, verse 30, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. What Jesus says to this scribe and to the audience watching him, after reminding them that there's only one God, is that God? I mean, you should love him completely. Right? With all your mind, with all your heart, with all your strength, everything. He should be your greatest love. The one Lord, the one God. He should be your greatest love. It's interesting because Jesus in Luke, one of the other Gospels, the Gospel that comes right after Mark, and you could look this up, Luke chapter 14, verse 26 and 27, and Jesus is kind of gathering disciples, and there's a large audiences that are following him, and a lot of people kind of are intrigued by him. Not necessarily so much different as today. A lot of people hear about Jesus and they become a little interested, a little intrigued. In this season, there are a lot of people have watched different devotionals and engaged in different messages they've seen online. So I think with everything crumbling around them, there's a lot of interest in Jesus, right? And so in his day, again, during Jesus' day, the Jews are kind of in captivity of sorts, not like we read about in the Old Testament, but they're under Roman rule. So their rights are limited. They're paying high taxes. Whatever Rome says they need to do, they have to do. There's a desperate desire for a new king, like a King David-like individual to restore, Israel back to their prominence. Right? And so, anyways, Jesus saying, and people are looking at it, and Jesus, when people are kind of making these ideas about maybe being interested in following him, in Luke 14, verses 26 and 27, he says, and if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whosoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Now, when we read this and we think, man, that's harsh. Like, you're talking about love today, Chad. And here Jesus says, you have to hate all these people if you're going to follow me. Listen, if we read this as Jesus saying is, you need to hate, and then you can follow me, that's not what Jesus is saying. It's a language of comparison. And what he's saying to those who are interested in following him is, listen, if you want to be a real, genuine follower of me, like your love for me, well, it has to be more than your love for your wife. It has to be more than your love for your mom and your dad. It has to be more, in comparison, your love for me has to even be more than your love for your children. See, that first portion of what we see when Jesus answers that scribe there in Mark, when he says, what's the greatest commandment? Well, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with everything, all within you. If you are going to be a true, genuine follower of Jesus, and we have to come to a point in which God becomes the most important thing in our life. Our greatest love. Now, guys, I think it's a process. Like I wish, honestly, I wish I could come before you and say, man, you guys, I have come to this point in my life as a pastor. I've come to this point in my life as a husband, as a father, as a son. That Jesus means more than everything in my life at all times. Listen, I can't honestly come before you and say that. There are many times in my life when I get off course and I get kind of persuaded by things. And sometimes we think, even in our Christian circles, that, if we're not falling into bad temptation, then Jesus is our number one. And Jesus, even in this circumstance, he's not saying like I need to be above deep, dark sins. No, I mean, he uses things in our life that we would consider good things. Family, like parents, right? Wives, husbands, and children, like those are good things. Things that we should love, things that we should spend time in, things that we should invest in. But if we are not careful, we can elevate those things above God. Make those relationships even greater than our relationship with God. And listen, if we can do it with family, and we can do it with finances. We can do it with our home. We can do it with recreation. There's a lot of things that we can fill in and elevate and put above the Lord. But Jesus reminds that scribe, he reminds that group there that, listen, that God needs to be first in your life. Your love to him needs to be your highest priority. In Luke, after making that claim, he says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciples. Listen, the Christian life, it's hard. It's not easy. It's not for the faint of heart. God loves us. And he's commanding us to love him too. I've got a little tread on my tires, a little experience in life. Some of you that are watching this have much more experience in life. I mean, my guess is that those of you, or a great portion of you who are watching this right now, are older. And because of this COVID-19 and the recommendations that we as a church have extended, and the recommendations that our government and different healthcare providers are extending, that you kind of refrain from social gathering. Listen, you have all sorts of life experience, and many of you, man, you guys can think back, you can reflect on life. You have experienced some of the hardest days of your life, the most difficult things that you've had to endure. And many of you, you've done that while you were a believer. You know, the awesome part that comes with that is oftentimes when I have those conversations with some of you who are experienced. So I heard another pastor refer to the senior citizens of his church as his legacy members. I love that idea, that legacy. So those of you who are older, I love talking with you. I love hearing your testimony. I love hearing stories of difficulties, but in the midst of those difficulties, how God was with you, how God loved you, and how God helped you through those things. And maybe in that season you didn't understand why, but when you step back, when you've gone down the journey of life a little longer, you see the goodness of God. So I want to encourage us with that today. I want to encourage us with this idea that we love God, that He becomes the most important things in our life. I think, honestly, as we begin to see different things, different restrictions eased up now. And I know that we're not out of this COVID-19 entirely yet. But there's a good sense of hope, right? A hope of beginning to return to some semblance of what life was like previously. One of the things I've tried over the last couple weeks to encourage us as believers, as part of our faith family with this, that we not return to normal, that we allow God to use these circumstances to change our lives. I don't know why God allowed COVID-19 to come. I don't know why He's allowed it to create such hardship, not just here in our state, but in our country and around the world. A hardship that carries with it a great economic burden, a great healthcare burden. I don't know why God allowed it to happen, but guys, God did allow it. And man, what a shame it would be as if we didn't come out of these circumstances that has changed everyone's life, circumstances that for most of us, we've not seen or experienced anything like it before. For some of us, this is almost like an opportunity to hit the reset button in life. Right? To almost re-engage with a blank slate, like almost to a certain extent, a redo. And man, as we go back into our lives and restrictions begin to be lifted, man, I pray, I hope that in this season that God has caused you to learn to lean on Him, and you have developed a deeper love for Him, a greater appreciation for Him, a greater sense of awe for His grace and His mercy. Hey, when Jesus is caught by this group of religious leaders, and this inquisitive scribe asks that simple question, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus responds with that first part there in Mark where He says that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. So in essence, everything. And then He goes on and He adds a little, it's like a comma, like a little additional part to it. So not only are we called to love God, but He says this in verse 31, He says, the second is this. So the great commandment, the first commandment, the most important commandment is to love the Lord your God with everything. But then He says this, He goes, the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Jesus didn't take and add 2 more commandments to everything they were supposed to follow in the Old Testament. No, in essence, what Jesus does is He takes all those laws, all that thing that they're supposed to, and he kind of condenses them into two great things. And he says, love God and love others. If you're going to be a follower of mine, if you're concerned about keeping my commandments, and listen, we would keep commandments because we want to grow in underneath him, grow more like him. We have a desire to have a deeper relationship with him. And so if that's our desire, then we're going to love God and love others. You all know that when it says there that word neighbors, they're not just talking about the people who live on the left hand and the right hand side of you. Right? We're not just talking about the people who live directly across the street from you, or maybe the person who lives behind you. We're not talking about those who you share an HOA with. Right? We're not even talking about like those who live like in your little community or your apartment complex or even in your city. Right? What we're talking about, what Jesus was talking about, and really what Jesus was commanding, is that you love others. I think right now, it is so critically important for us to apply both of these things in our lives. We live in a day and age where rather than a growing unity, there's a greater schism, a greater division, a greater pulling apart. I mean, one of the things that breaks my heart in the midst of all of this has been this understanding that people have, that typically in most cases, they gravitate towards two camps. One will say that the healthcare, that this COVID-19 is critically important from a health perspective. There are those that will think that has to be the most important concern, that has to be the greatest understanding. Like as we march through this, everything we do should be there to protect the health industry, the healthcare, the health of others. Like that's critical. And then you have another camp who says that right now, the most important thing that we are facing, the most important thing our nation is facing, the most important thing the world is facing is the economy. And if we don't fix this thing now, the economy is going to collapse. Everything within America is going to collapse. This is going to have such, collateral damage. Everything needs to be opened up as fast as we can to do that. Now listen, I'm not here to tell you which camp is right, which camp is wrong. Here is the harsh reality. They're both correct. They're both important. Right? The healthcare, it is important. The health and the well-being of those are very important. I will say this, one of the things that I've been proud about within our nation in the midst of this is there has been such deep, great concern for our elderly. I think something that has not been demonstrated in generations. Right? So often there's this great push or desire to kind of push some of these people aside for the new and the improved. And man, what we've seen, what we've experienced is at least what I'm perceiving a great concern for some of our elderly, some of those with underlying conditions. It's not this Darwinian approach of the survival of the fittest, and if you're not fit, get lost, okay? The economy is important. Right? There are things that are happening now that will not just affect us this year, next year. It will be something that will happen that will probably carry with us for generations. Like we are going to have to hand over a massive amount of debt to our children and our grandchildren. They are both critically important. What breaks my heart in the midst of this is neither camp can agree with each other. Neither camp can show empathy for the other. It's just, I'm right and you're wrong. And then mud starts flying. That is not Christian love. That is not the way it is. It's like dirty politics. Right? It's the Republicans versus the Democrats. Right, we can't agree. We watch it. Politics sicken me nowadays because neither side can agree with each other. And if I'm in this camp, I automatically hate you. That is not love. That is not biblical. God's called us to love one another. Listen, one of my devotionals a little while back, we talked about Ahmaud Arbery, young man, 25 years old in Georgia, going out for a run, and literally being run down by two individuals and shot and killed. From what I've read, from what I've gathered, a blatant act of racism. Listen, not only do we live in a country, in a society that is divided over what we feel is important in the midst of this pandemic, not only do we live in a country that's divided about where we stand politically, we still live in a country that's divided racially. And those things go deeper than just blacks and whites. Man, they're different groups. I mean, we've talked about immigration and undocumented people here in the United States. And then again, all those things. Listen, guys, I don't want this to become a political talk, but what I'm saying is this. We are commanded by Jesus to love one another. If we are true followers of Jesus, if we love him with all of our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength, then because we love him, because of the things that he demonstrated for us, then we ought to desire to love one another. It's interesting in Matthew chapter 7, there's the golden rule. Most people, everyone knows the golden rule. In Matthew 7, verse 12, it says, "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets." That golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. That's something I think that many people strive for. Listen, y'all, this statement wasn't a statement that Jesus created. I mean, this is a statement that can also be attributed to many other individuals and many other people that would be considered scholars or theologians or things that go way back. I mean, you can look at things that Aristotle and Socrates said that were very similar. You can pull up things that Confucius said that were very similar. One of the things that separates the approach that Jesus took versus the approach that these other individuals took was a perspective of positive and negative. Right? The other camp, the Confucius, the Aristotle, the Socrates, they took it as a don't do, a negative, like don't kill because you don't want to be killed. Don't do this because you don't want that. Don't steal because you don't want things stolen from you. Jesus took it as a more positive approach. He says you need to love, just like you'd want them to love you. Listen, that idea of loving others, it's not contingent upon them agreeing with you. It's not contingent upon them living like you do. It's not contingent upon them being nice to you. It's not contingent upon them being in the same political party as you, having the same belief when it comes to this pandemic as you, having the same skin color as you, having the same demographic, having the same education, living the same life financially, having nice cars, and none of that matters. See, when we follow Christ, when he becomes our everything, then our desire is to emulate him and to love others. Y'all, Jesus died on the cross for my sins. I didn't deserve it. But he did. He loved me. Even when I was a sinner, at just the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Read all throughout Scripture. Who was Jesus hanging out with? Did Jesus change who he was? Did Jesus act one way with another group and then go back to the temple and act all temple-y? No. Jesus' message never changed. He was just willing to love those who were in need and go to them and share. He was the same in all circumstances. And that's hard. So here what I want to encourage us, like the last quick couple minutes. So how do we do that? Most of us don't have the inherent ability to love others in that way. So when you look at that golden rule in Matthew 7, verse 12, in the NSV, or the ESV, it says, so. Well, what that means is it's a bridge to what must have been said prior to that. In the New King James Version, I believe it says, therefore. Well, what that means is you can't take this verse alone by itself. It's hinged, it's connected to something else. So for us to be able to do this, in order for us to have that positive love for others, even love the others that we don't necessarily agree with, wouldn't necessarily hang around with, don't believe what we believe, like how can we do that? Well, we have to go back up to Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. And Jesus says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone, or if he asks for fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good gifts for those who ask him? Listen, so we read that first, we read that passage, we start thinking good gifts, so we want to ask for all those other things. How many of us have genuinely gone to the Lord asking him to give us the strength to love? Because that hinge, that connection point to that golden rule to love others, well, it goes back to that idea of going, of asking, of seeking, of knocking. I mean, it's a continual thing. It's not just one quick prayer. No, it's a process. It's going before him. It's striving for. It's asking for. It's seeking. Right? We seek through God's word. We look for help. We look for encouragement. We look for strength in the midst of that. And then we knock. It's this picture of an idea of like knocking on a door. Cash has been sick. Not sick, but he got stitches. 23 stitches right on his knee. And so for the last week or so, we've had to kind of keep him downstairs. And at nighttime, he can't really get up and walk to the restroom and do all those kind of things. And so Cash and I have been bunking out together downstairs on the couch. And at night, a couple of nights ago, we started doing these knock-knock jokes. Right? I don't know if you ever noticed this, but like when it comes to knock-knock jokes, it's like unending. Like you just keep going. I mean, in Cash, if we're not careful, Cash and I for like 20 minutes will just be sharing knock-knock jokes. Now, we end up making half of them up, but we end up just sitting there laughing. But this idea, it's a continual knock-knock, who's there? Knock-knock, who's there? Knock-knock, who's there? And y'all, Jesus is saying the same thing with his prayer. Not that it's a joke by any stretch, but it's continual. It's going. It's continuing to seek him. It's continuing to ask him. And God promises, listen, just like a parent, if your child asks for bread, you're not giving him a rock. Or your child asks for a fish to eat, food to eat, you don't give them a snake. Like we do the things that we can. We give our children the things that they need. And God promises to do the same thing. Listen, in John 15:12, Jesus says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. God, at first, and Mark tells us, commands us to love him. And then to love others. To love others like he loved us. It's hard, it's challenging. I want to encourage you, for those who are like me who struggle with that. Man, start asking the Lord to give you help, to guide you, to strengthen you, to encourage you. These are exciting days, challenging days. As we walk in this next season of life, may two things become evident in our lives. that we love God and we love others. Man, I love you guys. I can't wait for you to be able to come back and join us again. We are here for you. We're praying for you. If you need us, please, at the bottom of the screen there'll be an email address that you can send me an email if you have a prayer request, you have a need. Maybe you've watched this and you've never given your life to Jesus and you have questions about that. You want to know how to become a Christian. You want to begin to love God and love others. Man, email me. I'd love to come alongside you and share whatever I can with you. I just want to encourage all who are watching. Love God. Love others. I'll see you soon.